I am Dr. Donald Wallenfang, secular Discalced Carmelite and professor of theology and philosophy at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. I welcome you to this second video presentation on St. John of the Cross and the Dark Night of the Soul. Specifically, this presentation will deal with the first of two dark nights within the one dark night, the dark night of sense, the deprivation of our senses. I don't know if you've ever had this experience in your life called sense deprivation. I know there are some facilities that allow people to do this, like where you're in water and you can't see anything, hear anything, feel anything. Essentially, like all your senses are deprived. And in the spiritual life, this is what St. John is after, what he's talking about. So practically, what does this mean in the life of prayer? It means we have to get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, get into a quiet place, a place of solitude, where we do close our eyes, where we do slow our breathing, where we don't move and fidget, where we're not even reading something, looking at something, thinking about something. Oftentimes the pump has to be primed, so to speak, in the spiritual life through vocal prayer and prayer of meditation. But if we're moving into the prayer of contemplation, as St. Teresa of Avila talks about, beginning with the prayer of recollection, moving into the prayer of quiet and the prayer of union, we need a very silent place and a stilling of all of our senses and even the higher faculties of our soul, the intellect, memory, and will. Everything has to be hushed, put to sleep. This begins with the dark night of sense. In his work, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 1, Paragraph 4, St. John writes that this dark night, the dark night of sense, is a privation and purgation of all sensible appetites for the external things of the world, the delights of the flesh, and the gratifications of the will. All this deprivation is wrought or accomplished in the purgation of sense. Wow, the external things of the world, the delights of the flesh, the gratifications of the will, isn't that what we're gobbling up every day as we go about life, these kinds of things? I'll at least speak for myself. I can tend to do this as a layman, as a married man, as a human being. I'm always concerned about these things. But entering the dark night of senses, like, put all that aside. Not irresponsibly, but with great responsibility for everything within your care, for everything within your charge, and you will be able to steward things, to be a great custodian of what's been entrusted to you in your life to the highest degree, because you're able to be attached from everything except God and the pure will of God being accomplished in your life. In his work called The Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 2, Paragraph 1, St. John says that the sensitive purgation, this dark night of sense, serves more for the accommodation of the senses to the Spirit than for the union of the Spirit with God, which will come later. So the first step in this deep contemplative way of being is to accommodate the senses to the Spirit. Oftentimes we work things the other way around. We accommodate the things of spirit to the life of the senses. It's like, no, that's not our highest way of being as human beings. But we can start to live like animals, or even worse than animals, when we accommodate the things of the spirit to the senses. Instead, we have to accommodate the senses to the things of spirit. Let the body conform with the soul and the Spirit of God animating the soul. But he's going to deal with actual union with God later in the second dark night of spirit. We'll talk about in the final video presentation in this mini course. Back to the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 3, Paragraph 5. St. John says that we call this nakedness a night for the soul. A nakedness of sense stimuli, a nakedness in terms of being fixated on all these created goods of the world. For we are not discussing the mere lack of things. This lack will not divest the soul if it craves for all these objects. So it's not enough to get them out of the room. we have to check our heart's desire. What do I long for? What's consuming my thoughts, my thought processes? Is it things of the world or things of God? It's not enough just to set them aside if I still desire them. So we're dealing with a transformation of the heart in really examining our conscience and the desires of our hearts. We are dealing with the denudation, the stripping away of the soul's appetites and gratifications. This is what leaves it free and empty of all things, even though it possesses them. So this is possible, to be free and empty of all things and at the same time to deal with them. That's good news. Speaking as a layman, a married man, a family man, that I can deal with money. I can deal with parenthood and my deep relationship with my wife, Megan. I can go about all of these very important activities in my life and relationships, and that I'm going to be strengthened to act with great responsibility and great love in them through this process of stripping away of all my soul's appetites and gratifications. Since the things of the world cannot enter the soul, they are not in themselves an encumbrance or harm to it. Rather, it is the will and appetite dwelling within that cause the damage when set on these things. So again, it's not the goods themselves, the things God made as good, that are the problem. It's my inordinate appetites and affections for them, my disordered appetites and affections. I'm not content with a little, I want a lot. I'm not content with feeling this dryness in my daily life, but I want more stimulation, whatever form that might take. And in our world, we surround ourselves with stimulation, especially through screens and digital things. And again, not that those things in themselves are the problem, but we have to examine our desires. What do I want? What is my deepest heart's desire? Is it to love God with all my heart, all my soul, all my mind, all my strength? Number one. Is it to love my neighbor as myself? Is it to live in great solicitude for all my brothers and sisters going through different things in this life? That is the Carmelite genius, the Carmelite point of recognition. Further in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 4, Paragraph 1, St. John writes that the necessity to pass through this dark night of sense, involving the mortification, from the Latin root meaning to die, mortification of the appetites, and denial of pleasure in all things. The necessity to pass through this dark night to attain divine union with God arises from the fact that all of a person's attachments to creatures are pure darkness in God's sight. Clothed in all these affections, people are incapable of the enlightenment and dominating fullness of God's pure and simple light. First, they must reject them. There can be no concordance between light and darkness. As St. John the Apostle says in his Gospel, chapter 1, verse 5, reading the Latin first, tenebrae eam no comprehenderunt. The darkness could not receive the light. The darkness could not comprehend the light. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 5, Paragraph 6, St. John says, "For in God, or in the state of perfection, perfect love, all appetites cease." All appetites cease in the state of perfection. This is amazing. We might wonder, how is this possible as a human being when all my appetites cease? By God's grace and by much spiritual exercise and ascetic practice. To be spiritually fit, we must engage in daily spiritual exercise and be in the habit of this. This is the way. one of my favorite passages in this Ascent of Mount Carmel, St. John of the Cross, which I think really gets at the how of the Dark Night of Sense. This is in Book 1, Chapter 13, reading from the Collected Works of St. John of the Cross. Book 1 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Chapter 13, beginning in paragraph 3. Two things to really practically enter the Dark Night of Sense. First, have habitual desire to imitate Christ in all your deeds by bringing your life into conformity with His. You must then study His life in order to know how to imitate Him and behave in all events as He would. Several years ago, there was this phenomenon, the WWJD bracelets. What would Jesus do? WWJD stands for. And I remember in college, I used to wear one of these, and the thing was, if someone asked you about your bracelet, you were to offer it to them as a gift. I remember giving a bracelet I really cherished a lot, my What Would Jesus Do to a football teammate in college. But this is what John of the Cross is getting at. You have to ask, what would Jesus do in every situation of your life? Try to imitate Christ in all things. How do I imitate Christ if I don't know enough about Him? He says you have to study His life. Where do I study His life? In the heart of the church. In and through the liturgy, in and through Scripture, through Word and Sacrament. Also, the lives of the saints are reflections of the life of Christ. Everything in the church helps me study His life so that I can imitate His life. The second thing, to enter the Dark Night of Sense, St. John says, in order to be successful in this imitation of the life of Christ, renounce and remain empty of any sensory satisfaction that is not purely for the honor and glory of God. Do this out of love for Jesus Christ. In His life, He had no other gratification, nor desired any other than the fulfillment of His Father's will, which He called His meat and food. Renounce and remain empty of any sensory satisfaction that is not purely for the honor and glory of God. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 11, Paragraph 5, St. John writes, everyone knows that not to go forward on this road is to turn back, and not to gain ground is to lose. So every day is a new opportunity for hard work in the spiritual life. It's kind of work we grow to love, and when we practice, when we enter the habits of this spiritual life, we know that all the delights are there. They're not so much in the things of this world. They're not in money and fame and fortune and honor and even health and wellness of body. It's in the things of spirit that is most valuable to us creatures of spirit and body. Finally, I want to conclude this second video presentation on the Dark Night of Sense with a nearby passage in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 13, Paragraph 6. St. John writes, endeavor to be inclined always, not to the easiest, but to the most difficult, not to the most delightful, but to the most distasteful, not to the most gratifying, but to the less pleasant, not to what means rest for you, but to hard work, not to the consoling, but to the unconsoling, not to the most, but to the least, not to the highest and most precious, but to the lowest and most despised, not to wanting something, but to wanting nothing. Do not go about looking for the best of temporal things, the things this world has to offer, but for the worst, and for Christ, desire to enter into complete nakedness, emptiness, and poverty in everything in the world. That is the dark night of sense. It's very radical. It's very demanding, but it makes sense that the most valuable thing in this life, that unum necessarium, that one thing necessary, that pearl of great price, that treasure hidden in the field, that coin lost but then found, the most valuable thing is the most hidden and the most demanding. It will cost everything because it gives an everlasting return.